Legend has it there's a 5,000-year-old book of magic. It was handed down by an Egyptian god and contains spells that can predict the future. It's called the Book of Thoth. And what it says is deeply mysterious. Some say it contains ancient rituals used by secret organizations.
Each person who is admitted to the order must die symbolically and be reborn.
Others say it offers readers the power to divine the future through tarot cards.
The original book of the Tarot was really engraved on gold tablets, and it was a book of Thoth.
For yet others, the book offers its followers a world of free love and drugs, central to the rock and roll culture of the 1960s.
Some of the most famous people in the world, like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, are deeply interested in this sort of thing.
But what is the truth about the Book of Thoth? What does it really say? Does it even exist? Now scholars in Egypt are finding the answer. This is the story of the quest to find the truth about what some claim is the most important book ever written. Central London. Among the hustle and bustle are bookshops specializing in the occult and esoteric. They sell everything from books on ancient wisdom to magic charms. But one of the most common images is that of an ancient Egyptian god. He's called Thoth, a strange figure with the body of a human and the head of an animal. And on the shelves are copies of his book, the so-called Book of Thoth.
5,000 years after the books of Thoth were originally composed, they are still beguiling modern people. I get asked to talk at conferences where the imagery above the stage, on the name cards, is a figure of Thoth.
So who was Thoth? And why does a text from an age dating back to the pyramids exercise such a pull, even today? The answer lies in a tangled tale that started over 2,000 miles away in North Africa. The Nile Valley. For years, at sites across Egypt, archaeologists have been uncovering what is probably the greatest civilization of the ancient world. Martin Raven has been digging at a 4,000-year-old burial ground.
We have uncovered this vast necropolis full of tombs with beautiful paintings, wall reliefs, inscriptions.
Digs like this have revealed that ancient Egypt had a sophisticated culture, a complex belief system, and a pantheon of gods. One of the most important was Thoth. He appears as a human body with the head of an ibis, or as the figure of a baboon.
Ancient Egyptian gods were invisible, but if they wanted to manifest themselves to our poor eyes, they needed a bodily form. Many gods had a sacred animal that was thought to be connected with them. The baboon, a monkey, looks very wise sometimes, very human-like. He must have deep thoughts. So he was connected with the god Thoth. The other sacred animal is the ibis. He's very quiet, he walks through the marshes, through the mud, but he looks as if he also has very deep thought.
To the ancient Egyptians, Thoth was a god with exceptional powers.
Thoth was the secretary of the gods. He noted down what they decided. So he became the god of wisdom, sometimes also the god of healing, and the god of magic.
According to legend, Thoth handed down this magic to mortals in a book. It was said to grant its readers amazing powers.
Ancient Egyptian literature has it that the Book of Thoth contains esoteric or magic wisdom, secret wisdom, that would allow an individual to communicate with the gods, talk to animals, to access the afterlife, these kinds of things.
There's a wonderful story about a very important magician who found out where this Book of Thoth is kept, and he appropriates it. And he suddenly understands the language of other animals. And also he sees all the stars moving in the sky. He finally understands the mechanism that is behind the whole universe.
Such was the reputation of the Book of Thoth. Its fame would spread across the ancient world. In the 3rd century BC, the warrior king Alexander the Great invaded Egypt. The Greek occupiers were amazed by what they found.
They were overawed by this ancient civilization with wonderful buildings, the pyramids, statuary, all of the fabulous stuff that we see today, but then it was in its full glory.
They were so impressed they adopted much of the Egyptian belief system, including some of their gods. One of them was Thoth.
The Greeks already had a figure of Hermes, who they believed to be the god who was the patron of what we would call science. He was the inventor of writing. So they came across the figure of Thoth, who the Egyptians believed was also the inventor of all the mathematics, the geometry, which had enabled them to build the pyramids. So the Greeks associated their figure of Hermes with the figure of Thoth from ancient Egypt.
The Greeks declared that Thoth and Hermes were the same god. It said they also adopted Thoth's book and created a new version, the Corpus Hermeticum. But as they did so, Greek influences crept in. The original Egyptian text and the new Greek text became confused. And so, as Greek culture swallowed Egyptian, Thoth's original text simply disappeared. One legend relates that a last copy of the original book was buried alongside the inquisitive Egyptian magician who'd read it and discovered the secrets of the stars. But whatever the truth, the original Egyptian Book of Thoth was lost, replaced by a new Greek version. The original text would not be rediscovered for thousands of years. The Greeks were followed by the Romans. The wisdom of the Corpus Hermeticum was absorbed into early Roman culture. But then came a momentous change. Christianity spread across Europe. References to pagan gods like Thoth and Hermes were banned. The Greek version of the Book of Thoth was suppressed.
With the rise of Christianity, and especially with Christianity being adopted by the Roman Empire as the official religion, this older pagan philosophy gets wiped out.
Those who advocated pagan ideas were burnt at the stake or broken on the wheel.
The general kind of ravages of intolerance and conquest led to the loss of the Corpus Hermeticum.
First, the original Egyptian Book of Thoth had vanished. Now the Greek version, the Corpus Hermeticum, disappeared from sight too. Whatever had been written in the Book of Thoth seemed to have been lost forever. But then there was another revolution in Western thinking. In the 1300s, the Renaissance arrived in Italy. It was a time of intellectual ferment and questioning. New ideas were born, and old ones rediscovered. They included the wisdom of classical Greece and Egypt.
The very word Renaissance means rebirth, and its first use of it that we find in the 1400s is somebody who says, I seem to see in this new learning the rebirth of the ancient culture.
Experience the past like never before with History Hit's award-winning original documentaries and ad-free podcasts with our expert historians like Dan Snow, Susanna Lipscomb, Lucy Worsley, Mary Beard, Tristan Hughes and myself, Matt Lewis. Sign up for an exclusive discount using the link in the description and embark on your historical journey from the wonders of ancient Egypt and the life of Anne Boleyn to the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte and the discovery of Shackleton's endurance. Get history wherever, whenever, exclusively on History Hit.
With it came a renewed interest in pre-Christian ideas.
If you think of Botticelli's paintings, for example, of Venus and Mars, or the birth of Venus, these are pagan gods and goddesses which are being painted for the first time in Europe for 1,000 years.
This new interest in the wisdom of the past included the rediscovery of the Greek version of the Book of Thoth, the Corpus Hermeticum. To the Christian culture of the time, it was an explosive find. The Catholic Church had been ruling Europe for over 1,000 years. There was a growing sense it was overbearing and overpowerful.
The institutions had become terribly corrupt. The office of the Pope had been thoroughly discredited, indulgence were being bought and sold. The Church had fallen into a very low respect by even the common people.
There was a groundswell of opposition. People began to look back to classical Egypt and Greece for alternative religious inspiration.
somebody brought to Florence the books of Hermes, the Corpus Hermeticum, and the court of the Medici, still reeling from the discovery of Plato and the pre-Socratic philosophers, suddenly found themselves with these books of Hermes, the books of Thoth, for the first time.
The Greek version of the Book of Thoth was translated into Latin and published in Italy.
It becomes one of the most influential books of the time. It goes into several printings over the next century and a half.
It may not have been the original Egyptian text, but it spread through the Renaissance world on a wave of optimism. What made the message of this Greek version of the Book of Thoth so exciting was its vision of man's place in the world. For those seeking to challenge the orthodoxy of the Church, it came as a revelation.
It was a completely different view of mankind, not as a fallen creature who, after being booted out of the Garden of Eden, wandered, lost. The discovery of the books of Thoth was saying, no, man has an exalted position within creation.
The message of the Book of Thoth seemed to be saying that man was more than a servant to the gods.
Not only did he have the same powers as the gods, it was his duty to use those powers to create a better world, a more beautiful world.
Thoth seemed to offer a new vision of the importance of man's place on Earth.
Roger, with the talk to you.
In the books of Thoth, it says that man is halfway between the angels and the animals and has a very special role. He is a co-creator with God, and he must create objects of beauty just as God has created objects of beauty.
There's this whole idea of optimism about man, about the powers of the mind, the imagination, the ability to understand the world.
To many people, the Book of Thoth seemed to offer an intensely attractive vision of mankind. What made this message even more powerful was its age. It seemed to come from a purer time, before the Church had been corrupted.
If you were a Renaissance man, the idea was formed in your mind that if we could somehow restore this ancient wisdom to its proper place, we could once again live in a pristine world. So what was old was really good.
And dating apparently from ancient Egypt, Thoth's knowledge was as old as any in the world.
If you think of it as this kind of cascade, you know, this sort of a mountain or lake at the top full of this clear crystal water, and then through the ages, it comes down. It's still the same water, but it gradually gets a bit muddy. And what the philosophers of the Renaissance believed when they had the Corpus Hermeticum in their hands is they were going to the source. They were going to, you know, sort of the pure waters of the ancient knowledge.
Yet the irony was that this whole alternative philosophy was based on the Greek version of the Book of Thoth. Nobody could be certain how much it had to do with the original Egyptian text. Yet in the name of Egyptian wisdom, it would now lead in some very curious directions. In the early 1700s, the first Grand Masonic Lodge was established in London. It would grow into the most powerful and successful secret society of all time. An organization of politicians and presidents, business and civic leaders. But in the early 1700s, it was composed of a small group of men looking for a better world. It was a time of war and intolerance. There was fighting between England and Scotland, Catholic and Protestant.
The period when Freemasonry was developing was a period of great immorality. Politics and religion, huge amounts of corruption. They were trying to find a way to bring people together, to forget those differences.
The early Masons cast around for inspiration. They found it in the Renaissance rediscovery of the ancient world.
We may not be able to trace the historical linkages directly, but we can say that the rituals and the foundation purpose of Freemasonry stretches right back into ancient Egypt.
Like Renaissance man before him, the early Masons were beguiled by Thoth's can-do vision of mankind.
The classical world in Egypt was seen as the start of real civilization, where things like science, like mathematics, mathematics being the foundation of building, the Masons then saw that as the foundation of the art that they grew out of. So there's a huge reverence for anything from classical times and from ancient Egypt.
To mark this reverence, the Masons adopted Egyptian images.
You suddenly get the importation of sphinxes, pyramids, anything to do with Egypt. We're sitting in Freemasons Hall in London, and lodge room number 10 there is a superb example of a restrained Egyptian architecture. They got copies of the Egyptian Book of the Dead, and the walls of their temples are decorated with those, with Egyptian pillars with lotus work.
Most significantly, the Masons focused on one particular part of the Corpus Hermeticum. It was a ritual every Mason would have to go through. It came, they believed, straight from ancient Egypt. It was the ritual of rebirth.
Each person who is admitted to the order must die symbolically and be reborn as a new person. And this idea of rebirth is central to the books of Thoth, to the Corpus Hermeticum. And Thoth appears again in all his majesty, just as he had for the ancient Egyptians, as the figure who would grant all knowledge to the initiate and also guarantee them personal immortality.
A new era claimed to have rediscovered the ways of ancient Egypt, even though the text they'd based it on was Greek. But nobody could say what was in the original Book of Thoth. As a result, there would soon be several other versions of it. Paris, the late 1700s. As Freemasonry was spreading through Europe, something new was stirring in France. Antoine Coeur de Jabelin was a French-Swiss writer and thinker.
Coeur de Jabelin, who was an occultist, he was a Mason. In fact, he belonged to the same Masonic lodge in Paris that Voltaire belonged to, and he was friends with the King of France. So he was really connected.
Coeur de Jabalan had two overriding interests. One was ancient Egypt. The other was card games. Cards were a popular pastime. Many were illustrated with mythical or popular figures and events. They were used to play a game called tarot, the 18th century equivalent of rummy or bridge. In the mid-1700s, Coeur de Jabalan put his two interests together. Thumbing through a deck of tarot cards, he came to a startling conclusion.
So he starts looking through the deck and he goes, wow, this is based on Hermetic philosophy. And then he starts looking through the cards and he starts realizing that they all seem to be about the most important book in the world, the book of knowledge, the book of Thoth. It was just disguised as a common deck of cards.
Coeur de Jabalan's theory that the cards were the original Book of Thoth was not as strange as it appears. He knew that the Egyptians would have used hieroglyphics to write the Book of Thoth. Hieroglyphics are pictures, so are tarot cards. It therefore made sense to him that the original Egyptian wisdom of the Book of Thoth could have once been represented by pictures on cards. It just needed somebody with the insight of Coeur de Jabalan to discover it.
So here we had this set of cards that were in pictures, but this could actually be this hieroglyphic book. So this could be the Book of Thoth.
In 1733, Coeur de Jabalan announced his conclusions in a new book. It made the entirely novel claim that the Book of Thoth, lost for 5,000 years, was actually a pack of cards. He even claimed the word tarot derived from ancient Egypt.
He said that the word tarot, he felt was an Egyptian word, which proved that the tarot was Egyptian. And he said that it was the Egyptian word tar-ra, which meant the royal road, being the royal road to knowledge, suggesting that it was the Book of Thoth.
It didn't seem to matter at the time that nobody could read Egyptian hieroglyphics. Coeur de Jabalan believed he'd stumbled on a profound truth and discovered the original Egyptian Book of Thoth. His book would generate widespread interest. One man captivated by it was an itinerant salesman, teacher, and spiritualist called Jean-Baptiste Aliette. For years, he'd been dabbling in the occult. He now took Coeur de Jabalan's idea and turned it into his own. He published a subtly different set of tarot cards. He called them the Atella Tarot.
He basically called himself Atea for magical reasons, and all it was his last name spelled backwards.
The cards had what Aliette claimed was an authentic Egyptian feel.
You see in this first card here, which represents a male querent, that he actually looks like an Egyptian man.
A querent is a person seeking knowledge in a tarot reading. But Aliette didn't stop there.
Okay, now if we compare the Fool in this Atea to the French Fool, you see the French Fool, and he's being attacked by a dog because he's a stranger. Now, to make it sound more Egyptian, Atea thought that the creature attacking him should be a leopard, thinking that leopards came from Egypt. So to see our Fool's being bitten on the leg by a leopard instead of a dog.
These cards, according to Aliette, represented the true wisdom of Thoth. Moreover, they could do something truly magical. They could divine the future. In 1788, Aliette formed a Society for the Interpretation of the Book of Thoth. It was a society dedicated to the reading of his tarot cards.
Just going to go and look at the long term up here. So what we've got here is definitely...
Nearly 2,000 years after it had vanished, it was now claimed the original Egyptian version of the Book of Thoth had reappeared, thanks to the work of 2 Frenchmen. The legend of the Book of Thoth had taken another twist. But there would soon be yet another version of the book. In 1904, a strange and idiosyncratic Englishman travelled to Egypt. He was called Aleister Crowley, a leading member of an occult society called the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn.
Crowley, he thought he was an artist, a painter, a poet, a great magician. He was going to be something great. He just knew he had greatness in him.
He even saw it in his name.
Some people pronounce his name Crowley and some Crowley. In his own writings, he said it's pronounced Crowley, it rhymes with holy.
One day in Cairo, he claimed he was told the ancient Egyptian gods had a message for him. Over the course of 3 days, he said he received a series of revelations.
He sat in his study at his desk with his writing materials, and then this being came in that was sort of like transparent, and came and stood behind him over his shoulder, over his left shoulder, and dictated to him what to write, and he just wrote it down.
Crowley had no doubt who was speaking to him.
Basically, this is a message coming from Thoth.
Crowley called the text he'd received the Book of Law. If he was telling the truth, this was surely the most authentic version of the Book of Thoth ever. It had come from the god himself. Crowley described it as a gospel for a new age. His version of the Book of Thoth consisted of a series of tenets.
So line 3 says, every man and every woman is a star. And so now he's saying that we're all like stars. You see, we don't need one central being to give us direction, that we each can find our own direction.
To this end, Crowley argued the most important tenet of his new Book of Thoth was "Do as thou will shall be the whole law." Thoth, in the shape of the Book of Law, became the basis of a new, freewheeling religion. Crowley called it Thelema. It was a religion in which almost anything went.
Thelema means will, which of course what everybody talks about when they talk about Crowley. But it doesn't just mean will, it means like desire. It means including like sexual desire.
Crowley's new version of the Book of Thoth put sexual magic at its center. And the sexual act became a sacrament.
They practiced free love. They took drugs. They had visions. They were promiscuous. They had lots of children. He wasn't trying to con anybody. He really felt that he was somebody important.
Finally, towards the end of his life, Crowley pulled his thoughts together. But it wasn't in a book. It took the form of another set of tarot cards.
Crowley felt that the tarot cards were this whole message of everything he was trying to get across, this whole philosophy of Thelema.
He published them as yet another version of the Book of Thoth. Thoth's book, originally written on papyri, had gone through another metamorphosis. Now it seemed a justification for, among other things, some very strange sexual practices. Crowley died in 1947, But his legacy would be carried on by a new generation. 1960s Britain. Crowley's version of Thoth was adopted by the rock and roll counterculture. His face even appeared on the cover of the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper album. A decade later, one man fascinated by it was Gary Latchman, bass player with the 1970s new wave band Blondie.
Some of the most famous people in the world, like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, are deeply interested in this sort of thing. They start getting into meditation, they start checking out their tarot, they start being interested in their aura and a variety of different occult sorts of things.
Latchman believes much of the counterculture of the rock and roll period can be traced back to the Book of Thoth.
People are talking about the Age of Aquarius, which is an ancient Egyptian tradition, this tradition of Thoth. This was something that was absolutely central to the 60s popular culture.
But in a further twist, the New Age explorers were happy to take ideas from several different versions of the Book of Thoth. From Crowley's version of Thoth, they took drugs and free love. From the Greek version, the Corpus Hermeticum, they took the idea of a purer, more spiritual age.
I believe the enduring attraction of the figure of the god Thoth, the philosophy associated with him, the ideas, is that it is this intuitive sense we have that life is deeper and more complex and stranger than what the official accounts tell us, whether that be science or the church. There are some very inspiring passages in the Corpus Hermeticum. Grow to immeasurable size, be free from every body, transcend all time, suppose nothing to be impossible for yourself. Consider yourself immortal and able to understand everything. Now, what strikes me as wonderful about that passage and many others in the Corpus Hermeticum is that it's showing us the potential of our own consciousness. It's showing us the potential of our own minds and spirits.
The meaning of what had once been the Egyptian Book of Thoth was now utterly confused. There were now 4 possible versions of Thoth's book and its magic. The ancient Greek version, the Corpus Hermeticum, translated into Latin and taken up by the Renaissance. Aliette's 18th century version, a pack of tarot cards claiming to authentically represent the Egyptian hieroglyphic text. Crowley's sexually licentious version, a deck of tarot cards coming, it was said, in a message from Thoth. And a 1960s version which mixed several of the earlier versions and came up with something different yet again. Four versions, all wildly different, all claiming to represent the authentic Egyptian Book of Thoth. But how could one book cover such widely differing interpretations? Do any of them, in fact, represent the original? Recent discoveries mean that today, for the first time, it may be possible to uncover the real truth about the Book of Thoth. For over 100 years, archaeological digs have been uncovering the mysteries of Egyptian civilization. Among them are thousands of texts written on pieces of papyri. If there is a real Book of Thoth, this would be the place to find it. But the papyri haven't given up their secrets easily. They're written in 2 different Egyptian scripts, some in hieroglyphics, some in a variation known as demotic. For centuries, no one could read either script. They were only finally cracked in the mid-1800s, with the help of one of the most extraordinary objects ever found. It's called the Rosetta Stone. It had the same decree written in 3 different scripts: hieroglyphics, demotic, and ancient Greek.
Before the discovery of the Rosetta Stone, people didn't know how to approach hieroglyphs. Essentially, they were just little pictures, and so people would try and describe what they see, treat them as symbols. In other words, the bird is in the house with the man, etc., etc. This didn't really bear much relevance to what the Egyptians were actually trying to say. The Rosetta Stone changed all of that. The Greek section could be translated. The hieroglyphic and the demotic sections said the same thing. So scholars could work back from the Greek and work out what the hieroglyphs were saying. That cracked the code entirely.
Thanks to the Rosetta Stone, scholars are now able, little by little, to work their way through thousands of fragments of papyri. It's produced some intriguing results. As the fragments have been assembled and translated, Egyptologists have found explicit references to a Book of Thoth. There are also references to magic. But it's not magic as we usually understand it.
People thought that it is a miracle that the moon doesn't fall down to the earth or even the sun, that there's a change of day and night.
So the magic of the Book of Thoth doesn't help you read the future. It's simply a way of understanding the world.
Magic is a way that we can make sense of the unseen world. So things like the seasons rolling, day turning to night and back to day again, illnesses as well, all of these things that you can't really pinpoint a cause for.
You could be alive one day and dead the other. And that explains that people were really looking for help in every area they could get it. And that's why magic was so incredibly important to them.
There are also references in the papyri to spells. But again, these are not spells as we normally understand them. They are not magic. A spell catalogued by Egyptologists as Spell 15 reads,
"May he grant that I see the sun disk and behold the moon unceasing every day."
Spell 31 deals with a common menace.
"Get back. Retreat. Get back, you crocodile. Do not come against me, for I live by my magic."
So these are not spells designed to perform extraordinary deeds. They're more like prayers.
The word spell doesn't really help the issue because this is very much our terminology being imposed over the ancient Egyptian literature itself.
So does this mean all the later interpretations of the Book of Thoth that see magic, supernatural powers in it, are simply misguided? Gradually, it's becoming clearer what the Book of Thoth is, and what it isn't. There are references to man being halfway to a god, as the Renaissance believed. And there are references to the Masonic ritual of death and rebirth. These clues suggest the Greek corpus hermeticum did contain some of the original Egyptian thinking. But there are no references in any of the papyri to tarot or images of the tarot cards. There are no references to Crowley's notion of free will or his promotion of sexual promiscuity. And there is nothing about the rituals of New Age mysticism. All these are complete fabrications. But there is something else in the papyri that's much more significant. Today, scholars question whether the Book of Thoth ever existed as a physical object.
Despite the mentions that we have, we're not convinced there's actually a Book of Thoth that we can one day find. Essentially, the references to a Book of Thoth or the Book of Thoth seem to be metaphors for the collection in its entirety of ancient Egyptian religious literature.
There are various compilations of magical knowledge written down in different periods, and to those believers of that period, that was the real Book of Thoth. But when we put them all together, they are all so different that there was not one central tradition. The Book of Thoth never existed.
So does that mean the legend of Thoth and his magic book will disappear? It seems unlikely. In 2002, a BBC poll named Crowley the 73rd most influential Briton ever. And a new generation is adding to the legends of ancient Egypt. New films and video games draw on ancient Egypt. And even if there is no Book of Thoth, that won't stop a new generation believing in it. The 5,000-year-old legend of Thoth and his magic is still a force to be conjured with.
There are secret societies, even today, who still hold Thoth to be the archetypal mystagogue, the person, the god, who will lead you into the arcane mysteries of consciousness.
It's very, very strange, but Thoth seems to have something to say to every century. He became a central figure for people who believe there is more in this world than can be explained by science.
In 1924, a young girl found an extraordinary object deep in the jungles of Central America. It was a beautiful skull made from a single block of pure quartz crystal. Anna Mitchell Hedges claimed that her skull had magical telepathic powers.
She felt that he could stare into the left eye socket and see the future.
Some say that Anna's crystal skull is part of an ancient legend. That one day 13 such skulls will come together as one to solve some of the great mysteries of life. but only if we are morally and spiritually ready to receive them. Some of these crystal skulls may have already been discovered. There is one in London, one in Paris, and one in Washington. But what is the truth behind the legend of these crystal skulls? Modern science has begun to investigate, and now we can reveal the shocking reality behind the story of Anna and these crystal skulls. Will they really lead to a new dawn for the human race and save our planet from an apocalyptic end? The story of Anna and the crystal skulls begins with Anna's adopted father, Frederick Albert Mitchell Hedges. A self-made man and adventurer who is said to be one of the inspirations for Hollywood's blockbuster movies, Indiana Jones. Born in Victorian London in 1882, Mitchell Hedges started out as a clerk in London's Stock Exchange at the age of 16, but he didn't stay long. In his 20s, he sailed to New York and worked on Wall Street, where he made a small fortune.
I had left home with a few pounds and no job, and I returned at the age of 23 an assured man of the world, possessor of over £4,000.
He then decided to become an explorer and archaeologist. Supported by rich girlfriends and various newspapers, Mitchell Hedges devoted his life to the exploration of Central America and the Caribbean coast.
He took in a number of well-off ladies who traveled with him and in one case essentially funded him. I suppose you'd call him a good time boy.
Mitchell Hedges believed that a life which is lived without zest and adventure is not a life at all.
You can almost hear the biceps rippling under his shirt.
He loved to do battle with giant sea fish.
Every fish he caught was the largest fish that had ever been caught in that area.
I landed sharks of 800, 900 and 1,000 pounds. Then, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I struck into a fish that gave me my hardest fight ever. It was a giant sawfish, 29 feet long, with a girth of 19 feet and just over 2 tons.
He claimed to have discovered a new race of people in Panama.
I now set about the task of discovering Central America. Thousands of square miles were uninhabitable, and there were wide regions of jungle, swamp and mountains where no man had ever set foot.
He stated that he excavated 21 sites in Central America and told many tall tales.
Every bit of jungle was crawling with poisonous snakes and poisonous plants.
He even claimed to have unearthed artifacts as old as 25,000 years from the lost civilization of Atlantis.
Anyone who writes a book called Danger Is My Ally, you know what sort of person you're dealing with.
But despite his bravado, Mitchell Hedges was keen to be taken seriously as an archaeologist.
Mitchell Hedges certainly collected a lot of exotic archaeological material, some of which he illustrates in his books.
I have given to the enrichment of the museums in England and the United States some thousands of ethnological, archaeological and ichthyological specimens. Never have I accepted a penny from a museum or institution either to finance my expeditions or in reward for my endeavours.
During the 1920s, Mitchell Hedges explored the Central American country of Belize, and it was here that his link to the world's most famous crystal skull began. Accompanying Mitchell Hedges was his 16-year-old adopted daughter, Anna. Anna had lost both her parents by the age of 10. Her mother had died during childbirth, and her father in the First World War. Mitchell Hedges had taken the French-Canadian orphan under his wing in 1917, and Anna became his frequent travel companion. At this stage, they weren't looking for crystal skulls. Mitchell Hedges was determined to find one of the lost cities of the ancient Maya civilization deep inside the jungle.
If we could find it, we hope to be able to add considerably to the knowledge of the Mayan civilization.
The earliest traces of the Maya go back at least to 1500 BC and possibly as much as 2200 to 2500 BC.
The Maya were one of the ancient world's most advanced civilizations before their collapse more than 1,000 years ago. Their empire stretched across an area from southern Mexico to the Caribbean coast of Belize. The Maya people developed complex writing and mathematical systems. Their astronomers mapped the stars and measured time with calendars as precise as the ones we use today. Great artists created fine sculptures, carvings, paintings, murals, pottery, textiles, and jewelry. They constructed monumental cities with intricate temples, plazas, aqueducts, roads, and pyramids.
It's interesting how much archaeological work in the Maya area is surrounded by a kind of a miasma of romantic quality, you know, the sort of gleaming white temples in the jungle.
It was those gleaming white temples that Mitchell Hedges was now hoping to discover.
I had repeatedly heard natives talk of great mounds of stone buried in the jungle, and I had a rough idea in which area they lay.
Like her father, Anna would record their adventures together in great detail, and it's her accounts we largely rely on today.
We arrived in Belize and went into the jungle, which was very difficult. And my father stumbled upon a stone, and he shouted to the world, "We can't be far from this lost city."
According to Anna, her father enlisted the help of locals who were direct descendants of the Maya to fell the trees and clear the bush. Eventually, their work revealed something spectacular.
In the setting sun, the immensity of the ruins we had uncovered came home to us with overwhelming force. Slowly, the sky crimsoned, a red glow tinged the jungle and the desolate courtyards, the terraces, the pyramids of this great city, which we called Labyrinth, the Maya word for the city of fallen stones.
Labyrinth is an absolutely fascinating Maya site. It sits on a dramatic ridgetop between two ravines, about 20 miles inland from the coast of Belize, and it consists of a series of courtyards and temples and palaces. It was founded about AD 700, and we know that it was abandoned by about AD 850.
It was here, at this ancient Maya ruin, that Anna claimed she made an astonishing discovery.
I was 16 when I spotted it. It was New Year's Day, 1st of January 1924. I heard two of the Mayas say, "If you go on top of that building, you'll have the most wonderful view." So I sneaked on top, and it was very dangerous. Something kept shining in my face. I moved 1 or 2 stones carefully. The sun was pouring on it. Way down below, through a crack, I could see something shining back at me. I got very excited.
Anna seemed to have discovered a chamber deep inside the pyramid, which was now overgrown with jungle vines and trees. What secrets, she thought, might it contain? Anna said how her father and his men cleared the stones away, and 3 weeks later, on her 17th birthday, she was allowed to explore the pyramid chamber.
I had a light, and I was let down by 2 ropes around my body. I was terrified of the snakes and scorpions that might be down there. But then, through the gloom, I could see something in the light. It was a skull, and it was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. So I picked it up, wrapped it in my shirt so it wouldn't be hurt, and shouted to the men to pull me up as fast as they could.
Anna said that her discovery was the size and shape of a human skull and was almost completely transparent. It appeared to be made of crystal and in perfect condition. According to Anna, her father took the skull from her hands and held it high in the air for all the Maya to see.
There was a moment of stunned silence. Then all the Maya helpers went wild with joy, kissing the ground and hugging each other.
But was the skull a genuine Mayan treasure? And who had placed it deep inside the pyramid chamber? The answer, according to Anna, came 2 days later, when they were visited by a Maya elder from a neighboring village.
He told us the skull was very ancient. It was made after the head of a great high priest many thousands of years ago, because the priest was loved very much, and they wanted to preserve his truth and wisdom forever. According to legend, it was used by the high priest of the Maya when he was performing esoteric rites. It is said that when he willed death with the help of the skull, death invariably followed. My father called it the Skull of Doom.
Anna said her father thought the skull was so sacred that he gave it to the Maya, much to Anna's displeasure.
I was very angry because I had risked my life to go down and get it.
But when their excavations of Lubantun drew to a close, Anna said the Maya priests gave Mitchell Hedges the skull for all the good work he had done for their people. The family returned with the skull to England in 1927. Intriguingly, Mitchell Hedges kept the skull entirely secret for the next 27 years, when he would write about it in his 1954 autobiography, Danger My Ally.
How it came into my possession, I have reason for not revealing. The Skull of Doom is made of pure rock crystal, and according to scientists, it must have taken over 150 years, generation after generation working all the days of their lives, patiently rubbing down with sand an immense block of rock crystal, until finally, the perfect skull emerged. It has been described as the embodiment of all evil. Several people who have cynically looked at it have died. Others have been stricken and become seriously ill. I do not wish to try and explain the phenomena.
Five years later, in 1959, Frederick Mitchell Hedges died of a stroke. No mention of the Skull of Doom appeared in his obituary in the Times, but Anna inherited it. It was now the crystal skull went public. Anna contacted a business colleague of her father's, San Francisco art dealer and restorer Frank Dorland, to promote her crystal skull in the US with a view to a sale for $50,000. Dorland wrote to her in November 1963.
The Skull of Doom, or perhaps more likely the Skull of Knowledge, as I have said many times before. I would like to handle this art treasure for you. We can launch a program about the skull and get your price.
Keen to make the most of her new possession, Anna wanted to prove the skull's authenticity. She flew to New York with it and left it with Dorland to carry out further research.
When I come out, it is so that I take out the Skull of Doom, which was the only thing my father ever kept from any of the expeditions. I hope that it too may one day find a home where it will be revered by all who see it.
Dorland spent the next 6 years exploring the mystical properties of Anna's crystal skull. He worked with various psychics and allowed other people to visit him to experience the many powers he believed the skull possessed.
Soon, peculiar things started to occur whenever the skull was out of the vault. We noticed that when we were very quiet, we could hear soft voices and music. Sometimes there was an odor, an elusive sweet, sour, wet fragrance that reminded me of apple blossom and vinegar, mixed with the unmistakable smell of an icy mountain stream. If we put our hands close to the skull, we could feel a tingling like an electric current, and there were other times when we clearly saw shapes and shadows moving about inside it. Here was an inanimate object sitting on our research desk, singing to us.
What was going on? In 1970, Dorland suggested to Anna that her skull should be examined at the Hewlett-Packard's laboratory in Santa Clara, California. One of the people that examined it was Charles Adams.
They brought this in, and it was quite an amazing piece, very well crafted. Of course, we were all interested in something like that, being quartz people.
The Hewlett-Packard scientists were asked to examine the skull to confirm that it really was a 1,000-year-old Mayan artifact.
We determined that it was a single piece of quartz. It was very clear. Well, we examined portions of the surface with a microscope. We couldn't find any tool marks that would indicate that it was done with modern machinery.
No sign of any modern tool marks at all. This proved that the skull had to be ancient.
It probably was done by hand over a very long period of time, probably more than one person's lifetime, where they take stones and rub them together and use sand and water to polish them out. That would seem to be the more likely way that this thing was built. Could have been, over several generations these things were carved.
All this seemed to fit with what Mitchell Hedges had written about the skull in his autobiography, Danger My Ally.
It must have taken over 150 years, generation after generation working all the days of their lives, patiently rubbing down with sand an immense block of rock crystal, until finally the perfect skull emerged.
But some scientists concluded something even more extraordinary. The crystal skull was so perfect that it was made by no known human process, which prompted one team member to remark, "This skull shouldn't even exist at all." Now Anna asked the scientists to do something even more difficult. She wanted them to prove that her skull's mystical powers were real.
The people who brought it in really wanted us to verify, mystical qualities of these things. And there's no way that, in science you can verify a mystical apparition, so to speak. And so we declined on that area of getting involved in any comments.
Dorland, however, wrote a letter for Anna stating that
it wards off the evil eye and carries protection from heaven. Being white crystal and highly polished, it defeats all evils and witchcraft.
Now Anna appeared to have supporting evidence of her skull's mystical powers and proof that it was a genuine Maya artifact. The 63-year-old Anna Mitchell Hedges set about exploiting its potential. Anna's timing was perfect. During the 1960s and early 70s, the Western world saw a new social counterculture revolution emerge, and with it, a new age of spiritualism. This led to a huge interest in quartz for its alleged healing, meditation, and energy-giving qualities. Crystal skulls were suddenly in fashion.
People are attracted to anything that seems inexplicable. So it isn't just touching something from the past, maybe seeing the future, but something that can't be explained on any level that one can think of. That attracts people's attention. People love mystery.
These aren't just skulls, they're transparent and they're very, very hard and they appear almost flawless. You handle them, you look at them, and they are impressive objects.
When you got the fusion of the imagery of the skull with the rare and exotic material of massive rock crystal, you got something that fascinated people, particularly in the New Age cults.
Over the next 30 years, Anna made the most of her skull's mystique and became a minor celebrity.
She would take the skull on tour around the United States.
Everywhere she went, she told people of her discovery of the skull at Luban Tomb and the amazing qualities it possessed.
The Mayan priests told me the skull is important to mankind. They gave us the skull for a definite reason and purpose. I am not exactly sure what that reason is, but I know it is something very, very important. I lived 7 years with the Mayan people as a child and ate and slept the same way they slept on the earth. And once you have lived with people who are so down to nature, you've got to believe them.
She would be preceded by a barrage of publicity to the local papers and television stations, which would be told that the rock crystal skull of doom was coming to town.
Laugh at this, says the Maya legend simply, and you die. The owner is the explorer and the collector is Anna Mitchell Hedges. Well, do you believe that one?
Yes, I do believe that, very much so. Because we've had quite a few accidents happen while we've had it.
What sort of accidents are those?
A cameraman who came to film it, and he laughed at it. And when he went to develop his film, the place blew up. And I still believe that the man is still running.
She would rent a room in a local hotel, and the skull would be put on a black velvet-covered plinth with a spotlight on it, and she would then charge $5 for admission to look at it.
She would allow people to touch it. In some cases, actually to lift it up and turn it round and look at it.
Has nothing ever good come out from the skull of doom?
Not to people who would laugh at it. But to me, it's always been very kind.
In what way do you mean?
Well, I love it because I first found it with my father, and it's my first little treasure that I found on my own, really.
Some people now started to link Anna's crystal skull to an even more extraordinary story. There is said to be an old legend from Central America which says there are only 13 ancient life-size crystal skulls in existence. These 13 skulls are said to contain vital information about the origins, purpose, and destiny of mankind. And that one day the 13 crystal skulls will all come together to solve some of the great mysteries of life. Over the years, some of these ancient crystal skulls may have revealed themselves. In 1878, an ancient life-size Aztec crystal skull was donated to the Musée de l'Homme in Paris. In January 1898, another life-size Aztec crystal skull went on display at the British Museum in London. Then, of course, there's the Anna Mitchell Hedges crystal skull found in Belize in 1924. Could these be 3 of the 13 ancient crystal skulls that were coming together to save our planet? If so, where were the other 10? Then, in 1992, something strange happened that would alter the world's entire perception of Anna Mitchell Hedges and the legends of the crystal skulls. An enormous skull, weighing over 30 pounds, turned up anonymously on the doorsteps of the Museum of American History in Washington, D.C. But this skull was accompanied only by an unsigned modern note. It said, "This Aztec crystal skull purported to be part of the former President of Mexico's collection and was purchased in Mexico in 1960. I am offering it to the Smithsonian without consideration."
One of the curators there called me and asked me if I knew anything about crystal skulls. So I knew the British Museum had a skull, so I said, well, yes, a little. And he said, well, someone sent us one, and I don't know what to do with it. So I said, well, I'll take it. So he said, ooh, don't look it in the eye. They're cursed. So that was the beginning of my introduction to crystal skulls.
Walsh discovered that human skulls and skull imagery featured in Aztec art and iconography and were often carved by Aztec and Maya engravers. But there was little mention of them using crystal for their skulls. She also noticed that the first crystal skulls only began to surface in public and private collections during the second half of the 19th century, and they were all associated with one person.
What I discovered about the Paris Museum skull was that their collection had been purchased from a French dealer in the 19th century named Eugène Bobin.
Bobin was an antique dealer obsessed with ancient Mexican artifacts. He first put on display an Aztec crystal skull in his shop in Paris in the 1870s.
He hunted and excavated archaeological sites and sold what he uncovered.
In 1878, Bobin's Aztec crystal skull ended up on display at the Musée de l'Homme in Paris. Walsh then discovered that another Aztec crystal skull had also appeared in Eugène Bobin's Paris shop. Bobin described this skull as a masterpiece of engraving and claimed it was unique in the world. In 1896, it was sold to the world-famous New York jewelers Tiffany's for the asking price of $900. The New York Times referred to the skull's sale as the highest-priced object in the largest sale ever held in this country. 10 years later, in 1897, that skull was on permanent display at the British Museum. Two Aztec crystal skulls, one in Paris and one in London, both linked to Eugène Bobin. In 1996, intrigued by Walsh's discoveries, the British Museum decided to collaborate with the Smithsonian to determine the origin of both their skulls.
The thing that really started us going was that we had a call from Jane Walsh from the Smithsonian Institution. She had been left a large quartz skull and was getting very interested in where it came from and also its relationship to the British Museum skull.
Just as the Hewlett-Packard scientists had subjected the Anna Mitchell Hedges skull to a battery of tests, similar tests now took place at the British Museum. The first thing they did was try to date their Aztec skulls.
You can't radiocarbon date quartz crystal. It has no carbon in it, it's impossible. So you have to turn to other methods to date it. Now, the way we nearly always do this is by looking at the way things were made, what you might call dating the technology. So we started on a program of analysis to look at the way the quartz crystal itself had been carved.
First, they started looking for tool marks with the most sophisticated technology.
So we have to use quite detailed microscopic techniques to look at the way these things have been worked.
Their tests revealed that the British Museum and the Smithsonian Aztec skulls were found to have some very faint traces of straight lines on their surfaces. Could a Stone Age technology have created these straight lines? The scientists examined the surface tool markings on several Aztec rock crystal objects from well-documented excavations in Mexico. This included a rock crystal goblet, which is the largest rock crystal artifact to have been recovered from a pre-Columbian site. The ancient Aztecs would have used hand tools and sharpened stone and wood combined with sand to craft their materials. The test showed these ancient tools left uneven, ragged lines on the surface. They then compared these ragged hand tool lines with the straight marks found on the British Museum and Smithsonian skulls. It was clear that two very different technologies had been used. Using just hand tools, it would have been impossible for the ancient Aztecs to create such perfectly straight lines as those on the British and Smithsonian skulls. The only way these straight lines could have been made was by using rotary cutting wheels. These were not introduced in Mexico until after the Spanish conquest in 1521. Further examinations of the two skulls were carried out under the powerful eyes of their scanning electron microscope. And the scientists made a shocking discovery. Both the London and Smithsonian crystal skulls showed clean rows in arcs across their surfaces. Only one type of tool could have done this, something with an industrial diamond head. Industrial diamond heads were first used in the 19th century. This meant the skulls could not have been made before then. There could be no doubt. The London skull, presumed to be Aztec and on show at the British Museum for more than 100 years, was a modern fake. The Smithsonian Aztec skull, found on a Washington museum's doorstep in 1992, was a modern fake. And the Paris crystal skull, labelled Aztec since 1878, also turned out to be a fake.
The British Museum skull was probably made not too long before it first appeared in Bobon's shop in 1881. The testing that the Louvre did on the Paris skull seems to indicate that it was created sometime during the 1850s. And the Smithsonian skull seems to have been polished using a technique that was only available after World War II. So it makes sense that it was probably made sometime in the 1950s.
3 fake skulls in London, Paris, and Washington. That only left the Anna Mitchell Hedges skull found in Belize in 1924. All the while, Dr. Jane Walsh had been continuing with her investigation. She came across 2 records referring to yet another crystal skull. The first was an article published in the journal Man in 1936. This told of a London art dealer named Sidney Burney who had purchased a crystal skull in 1933. The second stated that Burney had put his crystal skull up for auction at Sotheby's of London in 1943, and that it was sold to none other than a Mr. Frederick Albert Mitchell Hedges for £400. This was 20 years after Anna Mitchell Hedges had claimed she found her crystal skull in the ruins of Lubantoon. Anna immediately went on the defensive. According to her, there was a simple explanation. She had indeed found the skull in 1924, but in 1943, her father was experiencing some real hardship.
Father was wanting to return to Lubantoon, but was short of money. Mr. Burney loaned Father money, and Father left the skull with him as security until he could redeem it. Then he heard that he had placed it in a sale room, and Father was livid. He paid Burney with interest and reclaimed the skull.
But when Anna was asked if she had any records showing that the skull was owned by her father prior to Burney's acquisition, she said that all his papers had been lost during a cyclone. Anna Mitchell Hedges died at the age of 100 in 2007. She claimed to the end that she discovered her ancient Maya crystal skull in a pyramid tomb in Belize in 1924. Only in 2008, after Anna had died, did Dr. Jane Walsh get her chance to examine the Mitchell Hedges skull at the Smithsonian Institute.
The first time I saw the Mitchell Hedges skull was in my office as it was taken out of a velvet-covered container. And I was taken aback by the clarity of the crystal, the gleaming shine and polish of it. It really looked like a jewel.
Technology had advanced greatly since the Hewlett-Packard lab tested the Mitchell-Hedges skull back in 1970.
We decided to try and examine it in as many ways as possible. So we arranged to have it CAT scanned. We X-rayed it. We took silicon molds of it.
After an array of tests under a highly sophisticated scanning electron microscope, Walsh finally arrived at the truth.
What we're looking at on the screen now is a mold I took from a 3,000-year-old pre-Columbian carving in jade. And it's clear that they're using a sharpened stone that can only go sort of back and forth. It's also a very soft polishing technique that's been used, with a lot of the indentations on the stone remaining unpolished. In contrast, this is some of the teeth from the Mitchell Hedges skull. You can see some very tiny wheels that have been used to make the indentations on the chewing surface of the teeth. In the final analysis, when we saw these images, there was simply no doubt in our mind that the Mitchell Hedges skull is the creation of a modern stone carver using diamond tools, very small drills and cutting wheels that simply could not and did not exist in pre-Columbian times.
There could be no doubt. The Mitchell Hedges skull was a fake. Anna's story of finding it at Lubantoon on her 17th birthday in 1924 was simply not true. Suddenly it all fell into place. The reason why Frederick Mitchell Hedges never mentioned the crystal skull when he returned to England after his trip to Belize in the 1920s was because he didn't have it. Instead, he had bought the skull from Sidney Burney in 1943. He even wrote a letter to his brother in the same year telling him about it.
You possibly saw in the papers that I acquired that amazing crystal skull that was formerly in the Sidney Burney collection. There is only one other in the world known like it, which is in the British Museum, and it is acknowledged to be not so fine as this.
This revelation explains why Mitchell Hedges never mentioned in his 1954 autobiography, Danger My Ally, a reference to his daughter finding the crystal skull in Belize in 1924. In fact, she wasn't even with him that year. According to his autobiography, his daughter didn't join him in Belize until 1926. That's 2 years after Anna claimed she had found the skull. It has since emerged that there is no record of Anna ever visiting Belize until the 1980s.
It was an extremely graphic account. One could easily believe that she had been standing there, and yet there's absolutely no evidence that she was there at all.
So why did Anna invent such an extraordinary story? The answer may be quite simple. When her father died, she was left with no income. She had to find a way to support herself, and she only had one asset.
Her father was this great storyteller. He made a living writing stories of enormous fish that got away for the newspapers. And I think Anna, maybe having been around him for a long time, picked up on his ability to spin a yarn.
It appears that she invented the story, perhaps with her father, of discovering the crystal skull in a pyramid chamber in the Maya ruins of Lubantun in Belize in 1924 to make some money.
Through the gloom, I could see something in the light. It was a skull, and it was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen.
Anna Mitchell Hedges started as a liar, she became an accomplished liar, and she finished as a fantasist.
I first found it with my father, and it's my first little treasure that I found on my own, really.
I think over the years, having told the story so many times, she had come to believe it herself.
Anna managed to spin the yarn for more than 40 years, and most people who came to hear about the skull or had a chance to see it on her pay-per-view roadshow believed it was the genuine article.
I'm not really surprised she got away with it for so long, because people are always willing to believe the irrationally mysterious over the rationally prosaic.
People love mystery, and they probably, as a result, greatly prefer things such as the crystal skull to the average archaeological presentation. They'd far rather that those objects were so mysterious that we couldn't say anything at all about them, that they fit, in other words, the pattern of the crystal skull.
So where do these revelations leave the Central American legend of the 13 crystal skulls that says that one day they will come together to solve some of the great mysteries of life? So far, all the famous crystal skulls have been shown to be modern fakes, probably made in Europe. And science has yet to find any convincing evidence that there ever was a Central American crystal skulls legend.
There was no evidence for there being crystal skulls in any of the ancient American civilizations. In fact, the Maya didn't really have rock crystal at all. It's not a native material to the Maya area, so archaeology ignored the stories because they seemed irrelevant.
The fact that the legend seems to be a modern invention won't stop many people believing that there are 13 ancient crystal skulls still out there, and that one day they will all come together as one to save our planet.
It's one of the most famous Greek myths. Legend told of the ultimate monster, a half-man, half-bull that fed on human flesh. The Minotaur was so dangerous, it was hidden in the depths of a maze it couldn't escape, the Labyrinth. But then came the ultimate hero, Theseus, who ventured into the heart of the lair and slayed the beast. For thousands of years, most believed it was just a story. But could the tale of the Labyrinth, Theseus, and the Minotaur be true?
There is a physical, historical reality upon which these Greek myths are based.
One English archaeologist was determined to prove the myth was fact.
He became obsessed with the idea of the bull and the labyrinth.
And in his search, discovered a lost civilization.
The boundaries between prehistoric and historic were no longer hard and fast.
This is the story of Arthur Evans and his quest to unearth the Minotaur's lair, the Labyrinth. Arthur Evans was born in 1851 and grew up in the industrial town of Nashmills, 25 miles north of London. His father, John Evans, was a rich paper mill owner, but his real passion for geology made him one of the most distinguished scholars of the age. young Arthur showed no signs of inheriting his father's intelligence, and when his mother unexpectedly died, the boy retreated into a world of imagination. He was gripped by tales from ancient Greece, and his favorite hero was Theseus, the Minotaur slayer. The Minotaur was the monster son of Minos, the king of Crete. Minos had defeated the king of Athens in battle, whose forfeit was to feed the grisly beast with the flesh of boys and girls.
His body was a man's, but his head was the head of a bull, and his teeth were teeth of a lion, and with them he tore his prey.
Prince Theseus, the son of the king of Athens, was determined to end the contract, and by killing the Minotaur, win the love of his father. But Minos had hidden the beast in a labyrinth beneath his palace. People went in, but no one ever came out.
He went down winding paths, among the rocks, under caverns and arches, over heaps of falling stone.
At the heart of the lair, Theseus found the Minotaur. And charged at the beast.
And drove the keen sword through his throat.
The Minotaur was dead. Theseus escaped into the sunlight. Young Evans had no idea the story would lead him to make one of the greatest discoveries of the 20th century. But by the age of 24, he'd had enough of just reading about adventure. He wanted to live it himself, to make his own mark on history. His father, the great John Evans, had set the bar high with his discoveries of Stone Age Britain.
All sons of great men struggle, and they struggle under their father's shadow, and I don't think Evans is any exception to that.
Evans was referred to as Little Evans, so I think this may have been a bit difficult for him.
Evans was determined to find a way to prove himself.
He sees himself as kind of an adventurous character out of a novel almost, because he's heading off for adventure, and he knows that it's going to be quite dangerous.
So he set off for the most treacherous place he could think of. The Balkan states of Eastern Europe, ruled by the crumbling Ottoman Empire. But things didn't go quite to plan. Evans was arrested on suspicion of spying for Russia. He was released, but went on to be jailed again, and was finally deported for encouraging rebellion. He'd had adventure, but despite it all, still hadn't found his real purpose. Back in England, Evans struggled to find a job, until in 1884, family connections secured him a low-paid role in the backwaters of Oxford. He was now keeper of the Ashmolean Museum, in charge of a neglected collection of ramshackle antiquities. Action would be thin on the ground, but it was the ideal place to indulge his passion for ancient history, and, he hoped, find a subject to study that might enable him to match the achievements of his famous father. Evans's timing to make a name for himself couldn't have been better. Queen Victoria basked in the glow of a self-proclaimed golden age. Ruling over an empire that stretched so far around the globe, it was said the sun never set on her domains. Britain saw itself as the intellectual capital of the world, inventing the steam engine, the telephone, and the first light bulb. Engineers like Isambard Kingdom Brunel were pushing the boundaries, with architectural feats like Paddington Station, the world's first underground railway, and the largest ship ever built, the Great Eastern. Scientists around the world were making headline news. Chemists were filling the periodic table with new elements at a rate of almost one a year. Darwin was questioning the origins of man. Whilst pioneers in the emerging field of archaeology focused on the question of where this impressive Western civilization had come from.
This is a moment when European countries, feel very powerful, and intellectuals turn toward historical questions with a kind of confidence or desire to organize the past. People want to systematically explore what's underneath the ground.
At the time, most people believed classical Greece was the birthplace of Western civilization. Around 500 BC, the Greeks had invented an advanced culture. They'd influenced every European civilization since. The evidence was everywhere. Buildings, statues, art, literature, mathematics, science, as well as big ideas about the universe, democracy, crime and punishment. Some people doubted these had existed in Europe before the Greeks. Until archaeology began to overturn traditional beliefs. Evans had been captivated by news of Heinrich Schliemann, a German archaeologist who'd gone in search for the legendary city of Troy and found it in a Turkish hillside. Everyone thought it was a myth.
He notifies the world, this is it, I've discovered Troy.
The ancient Greek storyteller Homer had made the old folktale famous, telling of Paris of Troy, who eloped with Helen, the Queen of Sparta, sparking a bloody war between the Trojans and the Greeks.
And this is really the first moment when anybody starts to believe that these myths that survive from the classical period aren't just myths, but are based somehow in history.
That myth might be real created a press sensation. But Schliemann didn't stop there. He went on to the fortress at Mycenae in mainland Greece, where he claimed to discover the gold-rich tomb of its legendary king, Agamemnon, who'd led the Greek armies into the Trojan War.
Within the city walls, these very, very rich burials, one of which has this gold mask. And he said, I've gazed upon the face of Agamemnon.
Mycenae was at least 1,000 years older than the classical Greek period. Were the origins of European civilization more ancient than previously believed?
He confirms that there is a physical, historical reality upon which these Greek myths are based. And that is extraordinary.
Evans wasn't convinced Schliemann's discoveries were enough to rewrite the history books. So in 1883, he went to see the famous treasures for himself. But Evans quickly saw Schliemann was onto something. The treasures were clearly made with extraordinary skill. Coupled with impressive architecture and art, this was evidence of an ancient high culture.
You can see he's starting to realize, wow, wouldn't it be great to find a pre-Greek civilization that was the foundation of the classical era?
But Evans knew Schliemann was missing something vital. Something all sophisticated societies had. Writing.
Schliemann was looking for Mycenae rich in gold. He found the gold. Schliemann wasn't looking for script.
History was defined by what had been written down in the past. Anything that had happened before writing existed was just folklore. If the stories of ancient battles and mythical kings had been real, the people alive at the time must have had writing to record it. They'd have needed text to build palaces and fortresses, to make impressive jewelry. Amongst the rubble of Troy and Mycenae, there had to have been a script. Without it, there was no historical proof the Mycenaeans were the founders of European civilization, instead of the classical Greeks.
A couple buildings, a tomb, that's nice. Without a language, what do you have? Not a whole lot.
Evans saw his opportunity. If he could find a pre-Greek script, he would rewrite European history in a stroke. And he would no longer be little Evans. He would secure his place alongside his distinguished father.
Schliemann is getting all the headlines. His father had gotten all the headlines. I think Evans wanted to get his own headlines.
And so began Evans's quest to find the origins of Europe's high culture. It was a journey that would draw him into his favorite childhood story. If the Trojans, the Mycenaeans, and King Agamemnon had been real, was the Minotaur legend based on fact too?
All these characters are real. Is Theseus real? Is the Minotaur then real? Perhaps there was Labyrinth.
1888, Oxford, England. Back at the Ashmolean Museum, Evans's theory remained just that. With no evidence of a pre-Greek script, he'd reached a dead end, until his first clue unexpectedly landed on his desk. A priest, the Reverend Greville Chester, had donated his collection of ancient seal stones. He'd bought them in bazaars across Greece and the Middle East. Evans was told some of the stones may be from the area around Mycenae, and some had come from the island of Crete, the home of the Minotaur myth.
When Evans first gets his hands on them, he knows that there's a direct link through to what Schliemann's been finding on the Greek mainland.
They were small semi-precious stones, red and green jasper, amethyst, and cornelian, used to sign for goods or documents by stamping their imprint into clay or wax, like a signature. But as he examined them, Evans saw they were inscribed with minute images and symbols he had never seen before. Until now, these stones had just been collected as curios by wealthy tourists on their travels. But Evans wondered if the images could be the ancient writing he was looking for.
And one in particular clearly fascinates Evans. It is a prismatic stone. That is to say, each side has a different carving on it, and so a different sort of image is made by impressing each side. Evans spends a lot of time looking at this, and this is, I think, one of the pieces of evidence that builds the argument in Evans's mind that there is a language to translate.
The stones were an intriguing clue that writing may have existed before the classical Greeks. But Evans knew he'd need a lot more stones if he was going to identify a complete script. And he needed to prove, if it was a text, it was older than the Greek alphabet. His next breakthrough came on a trip to Rome, where he met a pioneering field archaeologist, Federico Halbert. He was an expert on the island of Crete. He told Evans that Cretan farmers regularly dug up ancient seal stones. All were inscribed with mysterious imagery and were worn by locals as necklaces. And he told Evans something else. The prime spot to find the stones was a place called Knossos. The site was rumored to hide the lost palace of the mythical king Minos, who'd built a labyrinth to contain the raging Minotaur. Evans was intrigued. It was dawning on him that the origin of the earliest European writing could be entwined with the Minotaur myth. And both mysteries might unravel at Knossos in Crete. But before he could even think about a dig, he wanted to decode the seal stone's secrets. And to prove the symbols were from a pre-Greek civilization, he needed more of them. A trip to Athens had paid dividends. He'd found stones just like the museum's gems in a flea market near the Acropolis. The merchants insisted they'd come from Crete. Evans was puzzled by the symbols. He could see pictograms of animals and people, as well as more abstract symbols that appeared in groups. All like Egyptian hieroglyphs, but quite unique. He had no way of telling which way they were read or what they said. But was he looking at a pre-Greek language?
He knows that they have something to say. They're going to tell a big story, and he wants to be the person to tell that story.
Evans had to take his research one step further, and that meant going to the source of the seal stones, Crete.
Evans was well versed in the ancient writings about Crete as he sails down to Crete for the first time. He must have been very, very excited. And as you come in from the west, he could actually see this landscape that he'd heard about from the ancient authors.
After 6 years studying the seal stones, Evans climbed the hill at Knossos in search for the remains of the legendary palace of King Minos, the home of the dreaded Minotaur.
You know, it's in the middle of an olive field. Things do grow over. It sort of looks like an abandoned archaeological site.
He jumps down into one of the trenches. These were very deep trenches. Down in the bottom, he finds the walls.
Evans made an instant discovery. He recognized symbols carved into the stone wall, the marks of an ancient world.
He sees engraved markings, in some cases identical to the hieroglyphic script that he's been looking at, working on, collecting, trying to figure out. This makes Evans realize here is direct evidence of the script.
A wall was engraved with symbols Evans had seen on some of the seal stones. There was now no doubt in his mind. Surely he was on the trail of the earliest writing in Europe. Then he made another discovery, which fired his imagination even more.
It all becomes very real for him because he sees what we call the double axe.
The double-headed axe was called a labrys, an ancient weapon, and some believed the sacred symbol of an early incarnation of the Greeks' greatest god, Zeus. Myth told of Minos and Zeus's alliance. Evans was convinced the mark proved the building had been Minos's palace. He believed the word labrys was very similar to the Greek labyrinth. Was there a connection? Was this the first stage in uncovering the truth about the Minotaur legend? Evans, a man of science, found himself becoming bewitched not just by the quest to find the origins of European civilization, but the desire to find out the truth behind the myth. To dig up Knossos' secrets, Evans had to get permanent access to the site. He realized he had to own the land.
As Evans stood on the hill at Knossos, he realized that if he was going to beat out all the other suitors, he had to own it. As he'd done with the seal stones, he had to own the artifact of the site itself. So he set about instantly trying to acquire it.
Evans left a local agent to land the deal and returned to Oxford to make an announcement. During Evans's travels around Crete, he'd bought a considerable number of seal stones. With more symbols to analyze, he'd managed to identify more than 80 different characters. And he suspected he'd found not one, but two variations of an early script.
He presents a paper basically saying that this is the earliest script in Europe. And so it's a huge, huge coup.
Evans had identified pictograms on some seal stones, images to signify animals and objects. But other stones had abstract symbols engraved in a line, a linear text. Evans wondered if this was the emergence of an alphabet.
For European scholars in 1894, the idea that there was this really, really early script that the Mycenaeans are using is a major breakthrough, because this is part of their definition for civilization. If you're civilized, you write history.
It's huge because it's a publication that argues that there's an undiscovered language that he's brought to the surface. What it does is it stakes Evans's claim as a big player in that field.
Evans had a tantalizing glimpse of ancient writing that might predate classical Greece by thousands of years. He wondered if a Mycenaean civilization on Crete was the true cradle of Western Europe. But to prove it, he needed more evidence of writing than just seal stones. If this ancient society was advanced, it had to have had vast amounts of writing. There had to be literature, a script to govern an empire, on a material that could survive millennia, like clay tablets. Evans waited for news on his land sale. War was now brewing over Crete's independence from the Ottoman Empire. But he was undeterred. On the 6th of May, 1896, he paid out £235 for a quarter share of Knossos, equivalent to £22,000 in today's money. By law, he could now force the other owners to sell their shares and become the outright owner of the site.
There is a great sense of luck about Evans being there at the right time and having the money to buy the land at the right moment. And I think time and chance was everything as far as Evans was concerned.
Nobody else can come in and take the prize away from him. And so this is a huge moment for Evans. This is going to be his big discovery. This is what's going to turn him into Schliemann.
The Cretan conflict forced Evans to suspend his plans for 2 years. But by September 1898, the war was finally over. With the Ottomans expelled from the island, now at last, Evans could dig. But full access to Knossos wasn't going to be cheap. Buying just a quarter of the land had cleaned Evans out. To buy the rest and fund a dig, he wanted to raise a staggering £5,000. worth more than £500,000 today.
So Evans ends up being supported once again by his father, but his father gladly supports him. Evans may have been ambivalent about this, but he certainly accepts the aid.
With his money troubles solved, Evans went on a spending spree. London's Regent Street and Piccadilly Circus were the shopping destination for the well-heeled explorer. Here, gentlemen could buy guns, specialist canned foods, and the latest exploration clothing. And Evans wasn't going to economise. His shopping list totalled £56 and 1 shilling, the same as a worker's annual salary.
And so he's criticized for, having lavish tastes. He has champagne, he brings all his food out, hampers of all kinds of goodies.
(1900), Crete. After a long voyage by ship, Evans stepped ashore. He was now the outright owner of the site. But after 16 years as a museum curator, he was completely out of his depth.
Evans knows that he doesn't really have the digging expertise required to handle such a huge project. He may have felt a bit daunted by the whole thing. He needed somebody with experience.
Evans needed someone who spoke the local languages, could manage a vast number of workers, and document any finds. He knew the right man for the job.
So Evans sent a telegram to Duncan Mackenzie, and Mackenzie replied, yes, on the next boat, as it were. It was all very, very last minute.
And the contrast between the two men couldn't have been greater.
Duncan Mackenzie shows up, and of course he's the exact opposite to Evans. Evans is a diminutive, brunette, aristocrat. Duncan Mackenzie is a tall, red-headed Scot who loves drinking with the locals.
Unlike Evans, Mackenzie was an expert in the field. He'd spent years working as an archaeologist in Greece and spoke the language fluently. And unlike Evans, who had a degree in modern history, Mackenzie had studied philosophy and archaeology at university. Mackenzie hired diggers and the group set off for Knossos. It was a moment Evans had imagined for 6 years. By 11 a.m., the men had erected a tent headquarters, borrowed from the British Army, and run the Union flag up a pole in case anyone was in doubt who was in charge. Before noon, shovels of dirt were thrown from the hill. The first full-scale excavation of the palace of King Minos had begun. First off, Evans searched for the outline of the building, starting with the walls found decades before.
Evans was probably filled with apprehension. He spent so much money, of his father's money. What if there's nothing there to find? What if he's completely wrong?
But as soon as Evans dug virgin ground in his second week, he hit the jackpot.
At the highest point of the site, there was a clay tub filled with inscribed tablets. This is something that nobody had ever found before in Greece or in Europe.
Evans discovered hundreds of clay tablets, many in pieces, inscribed with writing, a similar text to the seal stones, but far more advanced. Evans called it Linear B.
It's on a clay tablet, so it's not inscribed in stone. This indicates that there is a sort of a everyday use of language. He recognizes some symbols, but not all of them. He realizes that it's even more complex than he thought, which is, of course, thrilling to him.
And critically, a discovery of pottery meant Evans could date the clay tablets.
On the same day, they find a stirrup jar. A stirrup jar is a very specific kind of a pot that Schliemann had found many of at Mycenae. So it absolutely unequivocally connects the culture that Evans is digging at Knossos with what Schliemann has found at Mycenae.
The pottery was the same style as the Mycenaean finds on the mainland and dated to roughly 1400 BC. Linear B was at least 900 years older than the writing of classical Greece. For Evans, this was proof the Mycenaeans on Crete had invented Europe's high culture, not the more recent classical Greeks.
He's so delighted that he sends a telegram to the Times, but also to his father, and his father replies by sending him a huge sum of money to find more tablets.
The Times newspaper made the discovery public. And Evans's father was so proud, he wired a staggering £500 to his son to upscale the dig. But however grateful, Evans was anxious his famous father's support might cast a shadow on his rare moment in the spotlight.
Arthur Evans writes back to his father and says, thanks, and this is very good. He said, however, this is my excavation, and I have done this. This is my find. It's good to keep this in the family, but let's remember that this is mine. This was something that could not at all in any manner be connected with his father's accomplishment or status, but it was something he had made by himself.
John Evans's money was put to good use, and more tablets emerged from deeper in the ground. But Evans saw the writing on these clay tablets was different from Linear B. It seemed simpler and even older. He called it Linear A. Was this the missing link in the story of the script? Did Linear A bridge the gap between the symbols on the seal stones and the Linear B text? Evans was sure he'd discovered 3 stages of writing, developed by Europe's most ancient civilized society. It was an extraordinary feat and a personal breakthrough. Finally, he'd matched his father's achievements. He was now his own man.
He's making the sort of discovery that allows him to rise up shoulder to shoulder with his father.
But Evans was determined to go further. He wanted to reveal the root of the myth, too. He wanted to find the Labyrinth and the Minotaur. 3 weeks in, the diggers were excavating a room filled with rubble when they discovered a fragment of a wall painting, a bull's hoof.
And this, of course, for Evans is the Minotaur. This is where Theseus went in to fight. You have the tangible evidence that you're holding in your hands that links through to the mythological story.
It was Evans's first glimpse of what could be a Minotaur. But where was the mythical king? In the same room, Evans made an even more remarkable discovery. Embedded into the opposite wall was an imposing stone chair.
He says, I have found the first throne of Europe. Thrones of Europe are important things, and Evans has found the first one. It must have been an extraordinary confirmation of Evans for all the risks he had taken.
For Evans, its owner was beyond doubt.
It's become the throne of Minos. It's the labyrinth. Everything has to do with Minos. Minos and the Minotaur and Theseus.
But so far, no labyrinth. Evans kept digging. Finally, Amongst the debris, cascading staircases, deep chambers, and long passages began to emerge.
So he's excavating through many small corridors and rooms. And this no doubt brings to mind this concept of the labyrinth, of course.
Evans, the man of science, believed he'd found King Minos' maze, but he wanted to find more evidence of the Minotaur. Then, on day 55 of the dig, the workers were dusting through the rubble when they shrieked out loud.
They find the relief head of a bull fresco where the bull is bellowing with the tongue hanging out, and they leap back and they're horrified because for them this is an image of the devil.
They'd found a three-dimensional lime plaster fresco, a raging life-size bull, nostrils flaring, poised to charge.
Evans sees this as really a confirmation that this is the head of the Minotaur.
This is literally, in 3 dimensions, an illustration from the mythological past. It's bringing that mythological interpretation of the site closer to the archaeological remains.
So you have the labyrinth, and not only that, but you have the imagery of the raging bull there on the walls in more than one place. The public must have been completely blown over by this.
The myth of the Minotaur and the labyrinth had been based on something real, and he had found it. The convoluted building was the maze. The bull frescoes were the Minotaur. The throne belonged to the legendary Minos. He'd even found the image of the king in a fresco. Evans, once a man of science, had lost any reservations he may once have had about myth being true. It took Evans 31 years to expose the colossal building at Knossos. Covering an area of 22,000 square meters, it was the size of 3 football pitches. And it surrendered more artifacts than Evans could have imagined. Knossos was an engineering marvel, with a vast central courtyard, a grand staircase, and one of the oldest and best preserved ancient roads in Europe. A complex system of aqueducts, a sewage system, even the world's first flushing toilet. Evans had gone in search for the Mycenaeans, the oldest known advanced European civilization. But as his work on Crete progressed, he realized he'd found an even earlier society. He called the people of Knossos the Minoans. They were a highly sophisticated people who'd flourished from the 27th century BC, many hundreds of years before the Mycenaeans had existed. The writing of Crete had to be Minoan. In 1911, Evans was awarded a knighthood for services to archaeology. He was Little Evans no more, but the great Sir Arthur Evans. Over the years, Evans refined his theories. The idea of the Minotaur was great for generating newspaper headlines, but Evans had to admit it was more likely the Minoans had worshipped the bull as part of their religion. Maybe girls and boys had sailed from Athens not to be fed to the Minotaur, as myth said, but to jump bulls as a rite of passage. Could the building, with its countless rooms and corridors, have started the legend of a maze. Later archaeologists dismissed his model of the Great Palace of Knossos. Its design was a product of his imagination. He had ignored evidence suggesting a different story.
Evans discovered a new civilization. What he did with it was he turned it into the sort of civilization that he wanted, and he centered it around the Greek myths about Crete. He became obsessed with the idea of the bull and the labyrinth and what the mythology gave us.
Modern scholars don't believe Knossos was a palace, but a temple run by priestesses to worship gods and goddesses who ensured plentiful harvests. There had never been evidence of Minos. Evans had found several fragments from different frescoes and created his king. The occupant of the stone chair is still unknown. So why had Evans, who prided himself on being a man of science, fitted the facts into his own picture of the past? Had he subconsciously acted out the true meaning of the Minotaur legend?
The Minotaur for the ancient Greeks was something that you had to enter the maze and overcome. In a sense, it was a part of themselves.
Had Evans lost his objectivity because of his psychological need to supersede his father? Had he and his hero Theseus been driven by the same desire to win the admiration of their father?
Yes, I will make him love me, for I will prove myself worthy of his love.
Probably what the Theseus myth is telling us about is going into a dark place, confronting this wild and untamed part of yourself, and then bringing it down, basically.
Theseus had killed the beast, and Evans had slayed his demons. He'd found Minoan writing and what he believed was the origins of the Minotaur myth.
And he whispered, "It is done."
Evans made mistakes, but he was the first to recognize the importance of the seal stones, and his discovery of written clay tablets transformed our understanding of the origins of European civilization. After his death in 1941, Linear B, the advanced writing on the clay tablets, was finally translated. It was a sophisticated writing system with 187 characters. The tablets recorded the ownership of property by local people and their offerings to the Knossos temple. Evans had been convinced Linear B belonged to his great Minoans. But it was, in fact, Mycenaean. And astonishingly, it was the earliest form of the Greek language, at least 400 years older than the Greek alphabet. But why was the writing Mycenaean rather than Minoan? Today's scholars think they know what happened. The Minoans of Crete died out around 1450 BC. Then the mainland Mycenaeans arrived, and they discovered Minoan writing. The Minoans had been writing for centuries. Their script started as pictograms and hieroglyphs engraved on seal stones, and evolved into a more complex text written in lines, Linear A. To this day, the meaning of the hieroglyphs and Linear A is a mystery. But experts know the Minoans were writing 450 years before the Mycenaeans. 1350 years before the classical Greeks. Evans had been right all along. Western Europe's civilization didn't start with classical Greece. It didn't even start with the Mycenaeans. it all began with the even more ancient Bronze Age Minoans, and we only know about them because of Arthur Evans.
We now have a chance to look at this golden age and look at the art from this period and the wonderful architecture from this period and realize that this was a really spectacular time for humans.
Evans had discovered a long-lost civilization, and in finding Minoan and Mycenaean writing, had left his own mark on history. In the early 19th century, stories emerged of mysterious ruins that lay buried and forgotten deep inside the jungles of Central America. But a lost civilization in this region was thought to be impossible in the 1800s. Everyone knew that the continent had only ever been peopled by savages. But they couldn't have created such sophisticated structures. Someone else must have done it.
So Egyptians or Asians had come to Central America and built these ruins and then left again.
But then an American lawyer named John Lloyd Stephens and a British artist, Frederick Catherwood, went to see these ruins for themselves.
An artist and a lawyer go into a jungle. I mean, how more preposterous can it be?
They traveled hundreds of miles through the jungles of Mexico, Guatemala, and Honduras to search for the ruins. Eventually, they uncovered the remains of 44 cities.
It was extraordinarily exciting for them because they knew they'd found something the world had never seen before.
With their astonishing discoveries, the two amateur explorers overturned everything we thought we knew about the history of the New World. This is the amazing story of how Stephens and Catherwood discovered one of the world's greatest civilizations, the Maya. John Lloyd Stephens was born to a prosperous New Jersey family in 1805. He was classically educated, a trained lawyer, and a rising Democratic Party politician. And so he might have remained, but for a chance event. During a mayoral campaign in 1834, Stephens's voice became so hoarse with public speaking that he developed a serious throat infection. His doctor advised an immediate change of climate. Stephens took his doctor at his word. He enjoyed the thrill of traveling around Europe and the Middle East, writing about his adventures amongst the ruins of the Old World.
By the mid-1830s, he goes to Egypt and the Holy Land. He travels to Greece and Poland and Russia, and he really takes to it. He seems to have a real talent for travel writing.
On his way back to New York, Stephens stopped off in London in 1836. Here, he met Frederick Catherwood, a well-known British artist.
Catherwood was trained as an architect to begin with, so he understands buildings, he understands structure. And then he goes to the Royal Academy schools in London and trains as an artist.
Catherwood studied under some of the greatest masters of his time. Turner gave him lessons on perspective. Others taught him how to draw buildings, and Catherwood became a highly accomplished architectural painter. Like Stevens, Catherwood had traveled to many of the great ruins of Europe and the Middle East between 1821 and 1832.
Stevens and Catherwood acquired, really, very extensive knowledge, both of them, of the kind of archaeology that was known about at that time in the Old World.
While Stevens had written about these ancient worlds, Catherwood had painted their ruins in great detail. But then, Stevens and Catherwood would hear rumors of a new world civilization, which would define the path they would follow for the rest of their lives.
They come together and discuss what is just about on the radar at the time, and this is these curious remnants of some sort of ancient civilization in Central America.
Catherwood showed Stevens an intriguing book called Descriptions of an Ancient City. Published in 1822, it displayed illustrations of ruins with palaces and pyramids covered with characters and symbols in a mysterious place called Palenque in southern Mexico.
Catherwood showed him a series of books. One of them provided quite an avid description of Palenque, but had decided that, like so many scholars of the time, that it couldn't have been the native Indians that had created these ruins.
The idea that there had ever been a Native American civilization deep in the jungles of Central America was unthinkable to many in the 1800s.
Indigenous Indians could not have built these ruins, could not have built such great palaces, and they were magnificent palaces for a culture that never moved beyond stone tools.
Indians, according to historians of the day, were thought to be savage and primitive, and not capable of building such sophisticated cities. The view was that the ruins at Palenque must have been the work of other cultures.
They must have been an ancient culture from across the sea. So Egyptians or Asians had come to Central America and built these ruins and then left again.
The reason for this view was that historians had very fixed ideas. Critically, they believed all civilizations had to conform to a certain set of rules.
In the 1830s, I mean, Stevens and Catherwood, when talking about civilization, would define it in terms of cities and impressive-looking architecture. Evidence of rulers and rule, complex kind of agricultural systems, a writing system.
And then there is time for people to be artists, to sculpt monuments, to study the sciences, travel, trade, have a wealth of goods, have teachers, schools.
Everyone agreed that the primitive nomadic people of Central America couldn't have achieved anything like this. Though they weren't professional historians, Stevens and Catherwood believed that those who held that view were wrong. They could see no evidence that Egyptians and Phoenicians had ever been to Central America, and the images they were looking at were very different to anything they had seen in the Old World. they must have been made by an unknown Native American culture.
Stevens and Catherwood were extraordinarily different people. I mean, that's what makes them so marvellous as a pair, as a sort of Holmes and Watson, you know, of Maya archaeology. They could see that was evident in the New World was something very, very different.
He and Catherwood together were the first to look at these sites without the filters of thinking about Old World archaeology. Both are very much interested in these being indigenously authored sites.
These illustrations and vague accounts of a lost city aroused Stevens and Catherwood's curiosity. They decided to look further. Two years later, in 1838, Stevens got another lead. A New York bookseller showed him several more works relating to ruins in Central America. One was a large folio based on the personal explorations and illustrations of French archaeologist Jean-Frédéric Waldeck, which had just been published in Paris. These pages showed again the illustrations of the Palenque ruins in Mexico, first made known to Stevens by Catherwood. And there was more. The book also revealed illustrations of another strange ruin in Uxmal, in the Yucatan region of Mexico. Stevens then learned from the bookseller that yet a further set of ruins were said to exist in an area called Copan, in modern-day Honduras.
Stevens had read an account by a man called Juan Galindo, who'd actually been to Copan and written a description of what he'd seen there.
Monstrous figures are found among the ruins. One, a colossal alligator, having in his jaws a figure with a human face, but with the paws of an animal.
Stevens was stunned. He had now heard of three separate ruined cities. Palenque in southern Mexico, Uxmal in the Yucatan, and Copan in Honduras, all in the same region, but hundreds of miles apart. And who knew if there were any more? Stevens began to wonder, could these ruins be evidence that there had once been a great civilization in that region?
He is, among the first of these explorer writers to begin connecting the dots and thinking about this as a coherent civilization.
Stevens could see that there must be some connection between these ruins. And these weren't just one palace here and one palace there, completely different groups. There must have been something between them.
Back at home, Stevens became convinced he was onto something and was determined to find these three ruins he'd learned about: Palenque, Uxmal, and Copan. He began to plan an expedition to Central America. Because Stevens was now earning substantial royalties from his successful travel books, he invited his artist friend, Frederick Catherwood, to go with him. Stevens sent him word to get ready. The deal meant that Catherwood would illustrate any ruins they find in Central America, and Stevens would pay for it. Catherwood packed his brushes, paints, and reams of paper. He also packed machetes and pistols, as there was a real chance of trouble where they were going. British Honduras and Guatemala were in the middle of a violent border dispute, and the area was considered a very dangerous place to visit. Stevens realized that they were going to need all the help they could get. he persuaded the US President, Martin Van Buren, to appoint him as a special ambassador to Central America to help ease their way through the unstable region.
He's even given a special sort of frock coat to wear for the sort of official occasions. So he has that diplomatic mission which runs alongside the artistic and historical mission.
The only problem was, the 4 previous US ambassadors to have held this position had all died in office in Central America. Stevens received a letter from one of their widows, whose husband had died of malaria. It concluded with the ominous words, "May you be more fortunate than any of your predecessors have been." Stevens and Catherwood left New York on the 3rd of October, 1839, determined to locate the 3 ruins buried deep in the jungles of Central America. After a month at sea, the 2 explorers arrived in Belize, on the northeastern coast of Central America. Their plan was to first head towards one of the mysterious lost cities Stevens had heard about in New York. It was called Copan, and it lay in the western region of Honduras, close to the Guatemalan border. In honor of Stevens' diplomatic position, they were guests of the British governor in Belize, Colonel MacDonald, a veteran of the Napoleonic Wars. MacDonald warned them they were entering dangerous country, and his diplomatic pass would hold no sway with any rebel forces they may encounter. MacDonald put Stevens and Catherwood on a government steamboat and told them that if danger did threaten, they were to hang out their flag and send word to him. Then he sent them on their way with a 13-gun salute. Undaunted, they arrived on the coast of eastern Guatemala the following morning. Now the 2 explorers had to climb over the Mico mountain range to reach the Guatemalan border with Honduras. Once there, they would enter Honduras and go on to Copan. Stevens hired a guide who was fluent in Spanish and knew the grueling mountain pass that loomed ahead. Although only just over 4,000 feet, Mico Mountain was a treacherous route to cross. Stevens later described their experience in his book of the expedition, Incidents of Travel in Central America.
For 5 long hours, we were dragged through mud holes, squeezed in gullies, knocked against trees, and tumbled over roots. Every step required care and great physical exertion. I felt that our inglorious epitaph might be tossed over the head of a mule, framed by the trunk of a mahogany tree, and buried in the mud of Mico Mountain.
Catherwood looked at Stevens and groaned.
If I'd known of this cursed Mico Mountain before I agreed to come, you would have come to Central America alone.
Here's a guy in a jungle with guns on each hip and a sword, and in all likelihood wearing shades because he suffered from eye problems, inflammation of the iris, and there's a reference to him wearing spectacles. I mean, that picture when you think about it. I mean, Keith Richards got nothing on that.
Over the next 2 weeks, the party hacked through jungles and traversed perilous ravines.
It was jungle, end-to-end jungle, with no roads or places to stop off for the night. Food was a big issue. It seemed like they lived on chocolate and cigars most of the time.
They passed hillsides with grazing cattle that reminded Stevens of rural England, were hounded by biting insects and tropical fevers. And there was also the ever-present threat of running into ruthless rebels.
People get very nasty in civil wars, and the factions were already known to have committed atrocities and massacres and whatnot. And they had a very real suspicion of foreigners.
One evening, Stevens and Catherwood set up camp in an abandoned church. As they slept, drunken soldiers burst in, brandishing swords and muskets. Stevens recalled this incident in his account of the expedition.
Here we were in the hands of men who would have been turned out of any decent state prison lest they should contaminate the other inmates. Their appearance was ferocious, and doubtless, if we had attempted to escape, they would have been glad of the excuse for murder.
Luckily, the following morning, the soldiers had sobered up. Stevens and Catherwood were allowed to continue their journey to Copan. "14 days after arriving in Belize, the two men finally reached the area of Copan, a remote jungle region, little known by locals and rarely visited by travelers. As the two explorers worked their way through the dense forest, they suddenly came to a bank of a river. Across the water, Stephen's eyes fell on a large stone wall rising out of the undergrowth. It was 100 feet high and covered in thick, constricting vines.
It had more the character of a structure than anything we had ever seen ascribed to the Aborigines of America.
Stevens and Catherwood crossed the river to investigate. Stevens would vividly describe their experience of Copan and how they first set eyes on the ruins in his book of the expedition.
I am entering abruptly a new world. It is impossible to describe the interest with which I explored these ruins. The ground was entirely new. There were no guidebooks or guides. The whole was a virgin soil. We could not see 10 yards before us and never knew what we should stumble upon next.
Stevens realized they had to clear the ruins of its tangle of jungle vines before they could really understand what lay beneath them. Just as they were about to begin, they had an unexpected problem. The local landowner appeared. Stevens explained he wanted to clear and explore the ruins and offered to buy the land.
When his host is sort of balking at the idea, the first thing that Stevens does is he opens up his trunk, pulls out his diplomatic, sort of uniform, and claims that his host was overwhelmed by his shiny, American Eagle buttons.
At last, Stevens' diplomatic status became useful. He was allowed to purchase the Copan land for $50. Now, they could set to work. The following morning, the systematic clearing of the Copan ruins began.
Copan was extraordinarily overgrown at this point, so they were seeing little bits and pieces of Copan at a time.
At one time, we stopped to cut away branches and vines, which concealed the face of a monument, and dig around and bring to light a fragment, a sculptured corner of which protruded from the earth.
It'd be like finding one statue in Egypt and not knowing yet that the pyramids were there.
We go now and we travel there now, and they look very clinical almost, because they're very nicely cut lawns and all of the trees have been taken away. But they would have seen them thoroughly immersed in jungle.
I leaned over with breathless anxiety. An eye, an ear, a foot, or a hand was disentombed. And when the machete rang against the chiseled stone, I cleared out the loose earth with my hands.
As Stevens ran the excavations, Catherwood set up his station in the jungle to record the mysterious structures they were discovering. He used a piece of equipment called a camera lucida to help him detail what he was seeing with great accuracy.
He had with him this apparatus, the camera lucida. The light came through a kind of prism and gave you an image which you could see on a piece of paper, and you could pretty much sketch it or trace it. And it was a great help to Catherwood.
Catherwood, with his incredible knowledge of architecture, must have realized right away that this was something quite unique and that he was in a unique place, qualified to record it.
As Stevens and Catherwood gradually cleared away the jungle vines, they began to unearth evidence of a very sophisticated society.
They saw fantastic little elements of sculpture which intrigued them. And then eventually, as they carried on, they began to see these very large, great big monoliths. Seeing these, which clearly convinced them that this was something, they'd never seen anything like that before.
Working our way through the thick woods, we came upon a square stone column, about 14 feet high and 3 feet on each side from the base to the top. the front was the figure of the man, curiously and richly dressed, and the face evidently a portrait. Our guide called it an idol. And before it was a large block of stone sculptured with figures, which he called an altar. The sight of this unexpected monument gave us the assurance that the objects we were in search of were interesting, not only as the remains of an unknown people, but as works of art, proving that the people who once occupied the continent of America were not savages.
Right away, you can see how open he is, because he doesn't say, oh, that's a monster or a crude representation of the devil or something. He observes that they're very complex, must have been made by very talented people.
As the days passed, Stevens and Catherwood uncovered monumental structures that could have housed hundreds of people, and building blocks that showed all the hallmarks of a great civilization. They found large squares, terraces, and platforms with stepped pyramids, temples, ceremonial buildings, and shrines with altars.
We reached a terrace so overgrown with trees that at first we could not make out its form, but which, on clearing, we ascertained to be a square, and with steps on all the sides, as perfect as those of the Roman amphitheater.
I think they really were kind of astounded once they got to Copan, the extent of the cities.
The beauty of the sculpture, the desolation of the city, and the mystery that hung over it, all created an interest higher, if possible, than I'd ever felt among the ruins of the old world.
What is amazingly sort of human and endearing of him is the way he puts it, is that he says, after a time, looking at these things, it was evident these weren't the monuments of savages. These are sophisticated people.
Now, there could be no doubt. The two amateur men had found what professional historians had said could not exist. Proof that some form of civilization had once thrived in this area. And then came something even more extraordinary. Writing. Standing at the center of the ruins, their eyes fixed on a large stone monument with 16 seated human figures carved around it and 36 blocks of hieroglyphs on its top.
Catherwood knew from seeing all the Egyptian hieroglyphs that he'd drawn over and over again along the Nile that this was a writing system. And that the writing system, they talked together about this, probably had something to do with the images on the front.
As Stevens and Catherwood's eyes examined the hieroglyphs, they were aware that all the great cultures of the past had developed their own writing systems. The people of Copan had clearly done the same, just like the civilizations of the old world.
There were no associations connected with the place. None of those stirring recollections which hallow Rome, Athens, and the world's great mistress on the Egypt plain. But architecture, sculpture, and painting, all the arts which embellish life, had flourished in this overgrown forest. Orators, warriors, and statesmen, beauty, ambition, and glory had lived and passed away.
But it begged the question, who had built this place, and what had become of them?
The city was desolate. It lay before us like a shattered bark amidst the ocean, her masts gone, her name effaced, her crew perished, and none to tell whence she came, to whom she belonged, how long at her voyage, or what caused her destruction. In the ruined cities of Egypt, even in the long-lost Petra, the stranger knows the story of the vestiges around it.
Stevens was convinced the answer to who had built this civilization had to lie in the hieroglyphs. One day, when someone could read them, they would be able to understand the history of those who had lived here.
In regards to the age of this desolate city, I shall not at present offer any conjecture. One thing I believe, that its history is graven on its monuments.
Stevens really believed that these were historical documents, that they weren't simply, say, astronomical observations, that they're the stories of real people's lives.
Spurred on by their amazing discovery at Copan, Stevens and Catherwood continued their trek across Central America in search of other ruins.
They know that somewhere out there there's this palenque, and they've seen illustrations of that. So they were maybe already considering, well, maybe there's a very large area here. We don't know how it's constructed, whether it's an empire, whether these are kind of city-states. There was something definably similar across a wide area.
Over the next 2 years, they explored a vast region and traveled through Honduras, Guatemala, and the Yucatan in southeastern Mexico. Stevens and Catherwood uncovered, surveyed, and recorded another 43 ruined cities that had lain buried and forgotten for hundreds of years, including Uxmal, Palenque, Chichen Itza, and Tulum. And they found evidence of everything that people believed was needed for a civilization. Vast cities with central areas containing grand plazas, royal courts, and governors' palaces, proof of a sophisticated social hierarchy. Ornate temples, stepped pyramids, and monuments bearing hieroglyphic descriptions, proof of an organized religion. Gymnasiums and ball courts, astronomical observatories, intensive farming land, markets and trading centers, outlying villages, lookout towers and defensive walls with linking roads and causeways. All with a common architectural style that confirmed that there was once a single vast civilization here. Stevens and Catherwood returned to New York in the spring of 1842. They faced a new challenge. They had to convince the world that what they had discovered in Central America was truly groundbreaking. There really was a vast civilization that had once existed and thrived in a place where nobody believed there could be one. Stevens decided the best way to achieve this would be to publish a written, illustrated record of their expeditions. His first book, Incidents of Travel in Central America, came out in 1841 and was quickly followed by incidents of travel in Yucatan in 1843. Stevens' books contained over 200 Catherwood engravings and were an instant success, selling more than 20,000 copies within the first 3 months.
His volumes were really within the reach of the middle-class American reading public. And so the ruins reached a far wider audience than they ever had before.
Edgar Allan Poe called Stevens' work perhaps the most thrilling book on travel ever published. Catherwood then released his own volume, Views of Ancient Monuments in Central America, the following year. It documented their spectacular discoveries with 25 stunning hand-colored lithographs, which vividly brought the beautiful carved monuments, temples, and pyramids back to life.
What Catherwood did with his drawings was not so much just make pictures. He used the word draw in its larger sense of pulling. He pulled, basically drew an entire civilization out of the past into the present.
I think that there is a real parallel between Catherwood's painstaking illustration of every inch of a monument and Stevens doing the same thing in prose.
Together, the writings of Stevens and the illustrations of Catherwood would captivate the imagination of their readers.
Stephen had a fantastic rhetoric. His writing style was clear, descriptive, immersive, and he really portrayed a lot of his passion for what he was doing through his writing.
It was a perfect example of how the words and the images complemented one another. Neither one could have pulled this off on their own.
But for all their extraordinary revelations, there was still one question they could not answer. As Stevens wrote,
I now bid farewell to the ruins. I leave them with all mystery around them, and in the feeble hope that these imperfect pages may in some way throw a glimmer of light upon the great and long vainly mooted question: who were the peoplers of America?
Stevens and Catherwood would never know the answer. They both died early in their lives. Stevens from malaria at the age of 47, and Catherwood drowned when his ship sank crossing the Atlantic in 1854. He was 55. But eventually, Stevens' prediction would come true. When someone could read their hieroglyphic descriptions, they would understand who these people were. Over the next 170 years, the secrets of this culture's history were indeed proved to be in their writing.
Stevens is really the first Western explorer in Central America and Mexico, both to believe in indigenous authorship of the ruins and to glean the importance of the glyphs.
archaeologists, inspired by Stevens and Catherwood's explorations, managed to read the writings and the images. And a picture emerged of the rise and fall of one of the world's greatest civilizations, the Maya. The earliest traces of their existence go back to 1500 BC, and possibly as far as 2500 BC. Their kingdoms stretched across a vast area of Central America, from southern Mexico to the Atlantic and the Caribbean coast of Belize. Stevens and Catherwood's first discovery, Copan, was established in 450 AD and lasted for 400 years. With 20,000 people in an area of 100 square miles, it was the Athens of Central America from the 5th to the 9th centuries AD, at a time when Europe was lost in the Dark Ages. Copan, by any standards, was a highly developed and advanced civilization.
The Maya were a hugely sophisticated society and culture. They had a very complicated mathematics system. They were one of the few ancient groups to use the concept of zero, which is hugely important for mathematics. They had very detailed astronomy. They knew the movements of the planets and stars. They mapped the movement of Venus, for example, with a great amount of detail. Their calendar was very, very accurate, more accurate in many ways than Western calendars of a similar period. They managed to build these temples without the use of metal tools. They had very little metalwork, other than gold and silver for decorative purposes. They never had the wheel. They didn't have pack animals. There was no horses or carts or anything like that. But they were able to create temples as large, if not larger, than those in Egypt.
Stevens and Catherwood's revelation that a mighty Maya civilization lay buried in the Central American jungle was one of the greatest discoveries of their age.
An artist and a lawyer go into a jungle. I mean, how more preposterous can it be? But the thing was, the very different personalities with that overlap produced this amazing scope, which would never have happened if they hadn't been that different.
Stevens and Catherwood proved that you didn't need to be a professional academic to be a great historian. What you needed was passion, an attention to detail, and an open mind.
I think, essentially in finally judging their achievement, you had these two people that complement each other wonderfully well with this extraordinarily vivid text and the marvelous illustrations. And what you do have here, you have two people that have established the study of the Maya.
It was remarkable, not just an intellectual achievement. It was a feat of endurance. These were heroes. They produced a remarkable event under life-threatening circumstances. I think it was one of the great exploratory triumphs, absolutely, in history.
With their astonishing discoveries, the two amateur explorers overturned every prejudice we had about the development of cultures in the New World. Stevens and Catherwood had proved beyond doubt Native Americans had constructed a sophisticated civilization that compared to any of the finest ancient civilizations of the Old World.